Okay, so we're looking at the idea of corporate social responsibility, and the main issue in this little section of our business ethics topic is whether businesses should focus on making a profit or whether they should have social responsibilities as well. And on the flip side of that, whether businesses that have social responsibilities are really just getting distracted from what their goal should be, which is to make a profit. Okay? So if you look on the website of any big company or do a search on Google, you'd like to find they've got a section on corporate social responsibility. So just so I was doing this little lesson, I did a little kind of search fairly randomly on Tesco's corporate social responsibility page, and I found out a few things that Tesco do that, if you've shopped at Tesco's, you might not be aware of. So I found out that Tesco's provided 250,000 Christmas meals, which was news to me. You might have seen if you shopped in Tesco's that if you buy a 5p bag, they give you a little token, and you can put that into little boxes, and the boxes kind of go towards local good causes. You might also have noticed in Tesco's that they have food banks, like in lots of big supermarkets. So the idea is there you can donate food to less advantaged people. And finally, last thing in Tesco's, again, you might have seen is they have free fruit for kids. So the idea is there that kids and families can have a nice kind of healthy and free snack. However, in corporate social responsibility, one side of it is those kind of little philanthropic acts that businesses might do, but there's a kind of wider issue of whether businesses should be responsible to their shareholders or to wider stakeholders, and we'll look at what those two terms mean shortly. So the first kind of view of that is the idea of something called shareholder theory. And a shareholder is a person who invests money in the business in return for a share of the profits. So, perhaps if you ask your parents, you might find they own shares in one company or another. Nowadays, you might buy £100 or £1,000 of shares, and that, in some cases, means you own a small proportion of that company. In other cases, it just means that you're entitled to a share of the profits of that company. And what shareholder theory states is that the main purpose of a business is to generate profits and increase the wealth of the shareholders of that business, and that's all that business is really there for. And this is a theory which is associated with a philosopher called Adam Smith, who lived in predominantly the 18th century. And what Adam Smith said was that society benefited if people were allowed to act out of self-interest in a completely free market. And he said not only did that individual person benefit, but everybody kind of benefited, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive. But what he said was that if people kind of had lived in a perfectly free market, then sellers might have to compete against each other, and that would help to keep prices low. And the people who benefit most from those low prices would be poor people. So, for example, the price of bread and grain and fruit and so on would all be kept nice and low. The second thing he said was, if certain goods became scarce, like let's say there's a shortage of bread, they'd become more expensive, and that would in turn encourage more people to produce them because there would be more rewards, and so the kind of scarcity would get balanced out. And again, for Adam Smith, the people who really, really suffer when there are kind of scarcities of basic things like food were predominantly poor people. So for him, the free market helped poor people. That's one of the things it was good for. And lastly, one of the reasons that Adam Smith said that the free market was a good thing was it would allow some people to get really, really rich, i.e. it would generate surplus wealth, and that would enable them to perform acts of charity, so to give money to people who needed it. So he felt the kind of capitalist societies that produced lots of money, lots of wealth, were actually the ones that were best able to support poor people. A more modern version of this kind of approach is associated with a philosopher an economist really, called Milton Friedman. And he wrote an article called "The Social Responsibility of a Business is to Increase its Profits." And so what Friedman was really saying there was the only responsibility a business has is to make money, nothing else at all. And Friedman was writing in the early 1970s at a time when people were becoming, increasingly concerned about how businesses were operating. And so there were a few scandals in the 1960s and 70s, like, for example, people started to realise that smoking caused cancer, and that tobacco companies have been kind of knew that, but they've been kind of sitting on the research that would have told people that, so they weren't acting particularly ethically. And Friedman advances a few different arguments to support his view. So one argument that he advances is that businesses don't have responsibilities. The only things that could really have a responsibility is a person, and a business is not a person. So you might have a responsibility, I might have a responsibility, for example, as a teacher, but businesses aren't people, so they can't have responsibilities. For Friedman, it just doesn't make any sense. Friedman's predominantly writing about kind of executives who might manage a business on behalf of the owners of that business. And so what Friedman says is that somebody employed by a business, their primary responsibility at work is to their employers, so to the owners of that business, and not to anybody else. And so similarly, from that, Friedman said that the fundamental responsibility of employees is to try to maximise profit for the owners of their business, and that's the only thing they should really be concerning themselves with. And so for Friedman, if an employee acts in what you might call a socially responsible way, then effectively they're spending somebody else's money. So for example, if an executive had a choice between hiring two people who are both perhaps qualified for a job, one of whom's an able-bodied person and the other person somebody with disabilities, Friedman said that if the able-bodied person was the more qualified person, but let's say the executive hired the disabled person because they wanted to have perhaps a more diverse workplace, for Friedman, that executive is kind of almost betraying the sort of trust or the confidence of their employees, because their job is not to kind of make the world a better place, it's just to generate profits for their employees, so for the business owners. There are a few problems with Friedman's views. So firstly, even Friedman himself, although he kind of said that the only responsibility is to make money, even Friedman acknowledged that had to be done without deception or fraud. So businesses weren't allowed to kind of cheat, weren't allowed to lie in the way they did business. So I guess even Friedman does acknowledge that businesses have some kind of wider responsibility. There are a few other problems as well. So you could kind of say that Friedman perhaps doesn't pay enough attention to the role that consumers might have in this, or other groups. So for example, if a company is perceived to be acting unethically, then it's quite possible that consumers might just boycott those businesses, and they might instead spend their money on businesses that they think are ethical. So the Body Shop is an example of a company that has been over the years pretty successful, and it's kind of been successful by kind of saying, look at us, we're a really ethical company. And linked to that, equally, employees might prefer to work for companies that have very high ethical standards, and so perhaps the way to get the best employees is to be ethical. So for example, before I became a teacher, I used to work in recruitment, and I had to try to recruit people for the company Nestle, who at the time weren't perceived to be a particularly ethical employer, and it was quite hard to recruit people because kind of the university graduates who I was trying to employ, just for them, they wanted to work for an ethical company. And the last thing again is, if a company is perceived to be ethical, that could harm its profits because governments or local communities might take action against them. So for example, would you want a tobacco company to build a factory really near your house, or would you perhaps rather it was a more ethical company doing that? So the alternative to shareholder theory is perhaps a more modern theory, which I guess started out in the 1980s, called stakeholder theory. And a stakeholder is a person who is affected by or who can affect the activities of a business. And we'll look in a few moments about what types of groups and people that could be. And so what stakeholder theory says is that businesses have responsibilities to everyone who has a stake in the firm, and not just to the shareholders or the owners of the firm. And this stakeholder theory is associated with a guy called Freeman, who's obviously got a very similar name to Friedman, so don't get them confused. And what Freeman said was that businesses are social institutions, so they're part of a wider society, and their responsibilities are not just limited to their shareholders. So if we start to look at the kinds of groups that might make up stakeholders, these include groups like customers. So obviously, if a business decides to raise its prices, for example, then its customers might be negatively affected. Similarly, employees have a stake in a business, because if a business decide to expand, it might make more opportunities for its employees. Equally, if a firm was struggling, it might have to make redundancies. then its employees might suffer. Shareholders obviously do have a stake in a business because they're affected if a business is successful or less successful. And lastly, suppliers as well, because again, a supplier's livelihood is dependent upon that business and that business's success. And there are a few other groups as well which perhaps aren't as closely connected but still might have a stake. So competitors might be affected by a business. So if a business grows, that might be the expense of one of its competitors, so it might put other companies out of business. Governments can definitely affect businesses because they could pass laws that might affect the way they can operate, and equally governments depend upon businesses for some of their tax revenue. And the last one is communities. So this might be the kind of communities in which businesses are based, and it might be because if it's a factory that's producing pollution, obviously that's going to affect the community. But it could also be things like, again, if a company decided to shut a factory down, that would have a knock-on effect in that community because lots of people in that community might be out of business. Pubs and restaurants which once kind of had lots of business because there are lots of people with jobs and therefore some disposable income might suddenly decide to struggle or might find they're struggling. Also with stakeholder theory, there are a few associated problems, so we'll run through those. Perhaps one of the most serious ones is that the interests of different stakeholders very often compete. So for example, supermarkets try to keep the prices of basic commodities like milk as low as possible because that's what their customers want. But the only way they can really do that is by keeping the prices they pay suppliers as low as possible. And so lots of farmers in Britain have struggled for the last few years because supermarkets will only pay a really, really low price for milk. And so, it's one of the ways that supermarkets are criticised for not showing social responsibilities by prioritising customers at the expense of their suppliers. It could be criticised for being unrealistic. So sometimes businesses just have to take tough decisions that might just damage the interests of one stakeholder group or another. So again, if a company had a choice between closing down an unprofitable factory or just going out of business, then probably they'll close down the factory, even though that would obviously damage the employees who are based there. The next one, which kind of goes back almost to our first slide, is that for some people, and this is something that perhaps Friedman would agree with, is that trying to kind of address the needs of all stakeholders is just a distraction from the core purpose of a business, which should be to make money. And the last one is that some people say that kind of this might end up with quite hypocritical behaviour. So firms like Google might kind of claim to act in very kind of socially responsible ways, but on the other hand, they might kind of avoid paying, somebody like Google definitely have been criticised for avoiding paying taxes. So again, you might just kind of say that this behaviour ends up perhaps being quite hypocritical. If we're trying to weigh up between stakeholder theory and shareholder theory, then obviously one thing we could do is to try to apply some of the ethical theories that we've learned. And for business ethics, the ethical theories you need to be able to apply are Kantian ethics and utilitarianism. So if we turn to Kant first, that kind of focus on profit alone that comes with shareholder theory, Kant might say that it violates the second form of the categorical imperative in some circumstances. So for example, companies that focus on profits by paying workers absolutely tiny wages in sweatshops in other countries, that might be treating somebody as a means to an end because you're not interested in those workers or their lives or their well-being. You're just trying to pay them as little as possible. And that's treating somebody as a means to an end, so it breaks the second form of the categorical imperative. There also might be a case that some actions which are profitable cannot be universalised, such as breaking contracts. So, for example, Donald Trump, who you've probably heard of as being President of the United States, when he was a business person, he had a reputation for basically stiffing people on contracts. So what he would do is perhaps he'd pay somebody, or perhaps he would offer somebody a contract of $100,000 to install some glass in his hotel. Once he'd agreed that contract and they'd installed the glass, he'd go back to him and say, I'm not really happy with the job you've done, so I'm only going to offer you $5,000. Forget our contract, that's all I'm going to offer you. Because what he knew was that the amount they'd have to pay in legal fees to kind of take him to court and try and get their original $100,000 was more than $100,000 to start with. So they might as well just take the $5,000. And from a Kantian perspective, you can't universalise breaking contracts, because if contracts were always going to be broken, then there'd be no point in making them in the first place, because you'd never have any confidence that the other party would hold up their end of the contract. And finally, utilitarianism, the kind of stakeholder approach of considering the interests of different groups might fit quite nicely with utilitarianism and the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. On the other hand, if Adam Smith is right that society as a whole benefits from free markets, then again, you could perhaps make an argument for that on utilitarian grounds, that the greatest good is delivered for society as a whole if we allow complete freedom. And certainly some utilitarians have a strong kind of commitment to liberty, and so did Adam Smith. However, kind of think about perhaps a problem with utilitarianism is this idea of the problem of minorities. We've kind of learnt that small groups might, from a utilitarian perspective, it might be okay to exploit them if more people benefit. And so again, perhaps a small group of workers in a sweatshop that might allow lots of customers or lots of shareholders some kind of benefit, that might be justifiable from a utilitarian perspective. So that's it. Thank you very much.